Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Josh, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's video, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. Marcus Bennett had been in Singapore for 3 weeks when he decided to go jogging at Labrador Park just before sunset. And the moment his feet hit the gravel path that wound through the old coastal defense structures, he felt something shift in the air around him, something heavy and watchful that made the hair on his forearms stand straight up. He had read about the park's history online, about how it had been a strategic military site during World War II, how bunkers and gun emplacements still dotted the landscape like scars that refused to heal. But nothing he read prepared him for the feeling of being observed from somewhere just beyond his peripheral vision. The sky was turning a bruised shade of purple, the kind of twilight that makes shadows stretch longer than they should, and Marcus picked up his pace, his running shoes crunching rhythmically against the path. That was when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, matching his stride perfectly, step for step, breath for breath. Marcus was 24 years old, an intern at a tech startup in the central business district, and he had arrived in Singapore with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from someone who has never lived outside their home country before. He had grown up in Portland, Oregon, where the most frightening thing he encountered on a run was an aggressive raccoon or an unexpected downpour, and the idea of ghosts or spirits was something relegated to campfire stories and bad horror movies. Singapore felt safe to him, almost sterile in its orderliness, with its clean streets and strict laws and efficient public transportation, and he had been eager to explore the city beyond the glass towers and shopping malls that dominated the tourist guides. Labrador Park had caught his attention because it was different, a slice of wildness and history tucked along the southern coastline, where the jungle pressed close to the concrete paths and the old military structures stood like sentinels guarding secrets from another era. He had chosen to go at dusk because he wanted to avoid the afternoon heat, and because there was something appealing about the idea of running through a place steeped in history as the day faded into night. His colleagues at work had warned him about the park, mentioning offhandedly that it was considered haunted, that locals avoided it after dark, but Marcus had laughed it off, dismissing it as superstition, the kind of folklore every place seemed to cultivate to add a layer of mystery to otherwise ordinary landscapes. He had never believed in ghosts, had never felt the presence of anything beyond the tangible world, and he certainly did not expect that belief to be challenged on a casual evening jog. The footsteps behind him were precise, almost mechanical in their rhythm, and Marcus slowed his pace just slightly to see if the sound would adjust, and it did, matching him exactly, as though whoever was running behind him was synchronized to his every movement. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see another jogger, maybe a local out for their evening exercise. But the path behind him was empty, just the darkening stretch of gravel and the looming shapes of trees on either side. The sound continued, crisp and clear, the unmistakable crunch of shoes on gravel, and Marcus felt his heart rate spike in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion of running. He told himself it was an echo, that the acoustics of the park were playing tricks on him, that the dense foliage and the old concrete structures were bouncing sound in strange ways. But the explanation felt thin, unconvincing, because echoes do not keep perfect time, do not adjust when you slow down or speed up. He picked up his pace again, his breathing becoming heavier, and the footsteps quickened in response, staying right behind him, close enough that he should have been able to feel the presence of another person, close enough that he should have heard breathing or the rustle of clothing. But there was nothing, just the relentless rhythm of steps that were not his own. Marcus veered off the main path onto a narrower trail that led toward one of the old bunkers, thinking that maybe changing direction would shake off whatever was causing the sound. And for a moment there was silence, blessed and complete, and he felt a wave of relief wash over him, a confirmation that it had all been in his head. But then the footsteps returned, heavier now, more deliberate, and they were no longer behind him but beside him, pacing him from just off the trail, moving through the underbrush with a steadiness that no living person could maintain in that terrain. Marcus stopped abruptly, his chest heaving, and he pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he activated the flashlight and swept it across the area where the sound was coming from, and the beam cut through the twilight, illuminating the twisted roots and dense greenery. But there was nothing there, no one, just the empty jungle and the fading light. He stood there for several long seconds, his pulse pounding in his ears, and he tried to rationalize what was happening, tried to convince himself that it was an animal, maybe a wild boar or a monitor lizard moving through the brush. But the footsteps had been too regular, too human, and they had matched his pace with an intelligence that no animal possessed. He turned off the flashlight to conserve battery, and the moment the light disappeared, he saw it, just at the edge of his vision, a figure standing about 20 feet away on the trail he had just left. It was the shape of a man, but the details were wrong, blurred and indistinct, as though he were looking at someone through a layer of fog, and the figure was wearing what looked like a uniform, something old-fashioned and military, with a cap and a belt and boots that came up to the calves. Marcus froze, every muscle in his body locking up, and he slowly turned his head to look directly at the figure. But the moment he did, it vanished, simply ceased to exist, leaving nothing but the empty path and the gathering darkness. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, and he told himself to leave, to get back to the main road and get out of the park. But his legs felt heavy, uncooperative, and he had to force himself to move, to start walking back the way he came. The footsteps resumed immediately, falling into step behind him. And this time Marcus did not look back, didn't try to shine his light, because some part of him, some deep instinctive part, knew that whatever was following him did not want to be seen, and that seeing it clearly would be worse than the uncertainty. He walked quickly, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, and the figure appeared again, this time in his peripheral vision on the left, marching parallel to him through the trees, its movements stiff and formal like a soldier on patrol. Marcus broke into a run, his fear overriding his exhaustion, and the footsteps kept pace, relentless and unchanging, and he could feel the presence now, a cold weight in the air that pressed against his back and made his skin prickle with goosebumps. The peak of the experience came when Marcus reached the section of the park where the old gun emplacements overlooked the water, where the massive concrete structures loomed like the ruins of some ancient civilization, and the footsteps suddenly stopped, leaving him in a silence so complete it felt suffocating. He slowed to a halt, gasping for air, and he turned in a slow circle, scanning the area, and that was when he saw the figure standing directly in front of him, no more than 10 feet away, fully visible now in the last light of the dying sun. It was a man, or had been a man, dressed in a Japanese military uniform from the Second World War, the kind Marcus had seen in history books and documentaries, with a cap pulled low over the eyes and a rifle slung across the shoulder. The face was pale, almost luminous in the dim light, with hollow eyes that stared straight ahead, not at Marcus, but through him, as though he were not there at all. The figure was motionless, frozen in a stance that suggested readiness, alertness, and Marcus could see details now that made his stomach turn. The way the uniform was torn and stained, the way one of the boots was missing, leaving a bare foot that was gray and lifeless. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his body would not obey, and he stood there paralyzed, staring at the apparition that stood between him and the path back to safety. The figure began to move, not toward Marcus, but past him, marching with that same stiff, mechanical gait, and as it passed, Marcus felt a wave of cold so intense it made his teeth chatter, a cold that seemed to come from inside his bones rather than the air around him. The figure walked to the edge of the gun emplacement, stopped at the very edge where the concrete met empty air, and then it turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at Marcus for the first time. And in that moment, Marcus felt something break inside him, some fundamental understanding of the world that he had carried his entire life. The eyes were not empty, as he had first thought, but filled with something he could not name, something between rage and sorrow, and a terrible, endless exhaustion. And then the figure stepped backward off the edge and disappeared into the gathering darkness below. Marcus ran, truly ran, with a speed and desperation he did not know he possessed. And he did not stop until he reached the park entrance, where the streetlights and the sounds of traffic provided a barrier between him and whatever he had left behind in the shadows. He bent over, hands on his knees, and vomited onto the grass, his body shaking uncontrollably. And it took him several minutes before he could stand upright and walk to the nearest MRT station. The next day, he told himself it had been exhaustion, dehydration, maybe a touch of heat stroke that had caused him to hallucinate. But the explanation felt hollow, and he found himself researching the park's history obsessively, reading about the battles that had taken place there, about the Japanese occupation, and the soldiers who had died defending or attacking the coastline. He learned that the area where he had been running was considered one of the most haunted spots in Singapore, that locals reported seeing figures in old uniforms, hearing footsteps and voices in languages they did not understand, and that the spirits were believed to be soldiers who had died violently, whose bodies had never been properly recovered or honored. One article mentioned a Japanese scout who had been killed near the shoreline, shot while on patrol, and whose body had been left in the jungle for days before being found. And Marcus felt his blood run cold as he read the description, because it matched what he had seen almost perfectly. He never went back to Labrador Park, never jogged alone at dusk again, and when his colleagues asked him why he looked so pale, why he seemed jumpy and distracted, he told them he was just tired, just adjusting to the time difference, because how could he explain that he had seen something that should not exist? That he had been followed by a ghost who was still marching, still patrolling, still trapped in the moment of his death. 3 days after the incident, Marcus was having lunch with a group of local colleagues, and when the conversation turned to weekend plans, he mentioned offhandedly that he had tried jogging at Labrador Park and found it unsettling. The table went quiet, and one of his colleagues, a woman named Priya, who had lived in Singapore her entire life, looked at him with an expression that was both sympathetic and knowing. She asked him what time he had been there, and when he said just before sunset, she nodded slowly and exchanged glances with the others at the table. Priya told him that everyone knew not to go to Labrador Park at dusk, that the spirits there were most active during the transition between day and night, when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. She described seeing the same figure Marcus had seen, a Japanese soldier who appeared to joggers and hikers, always marching, always keeping pace. And she said that the spirit was believed to be a scout who had been killed during the final days of the war, shot by Allied forces as he patrolled the coastline looking for enemy positions. The scout's body had been left where it fell, and by the time the Japanese forces retreated, it had decomposed beyond recognition, and so it was never claimed, never given the proper rituals that would allow the spirit to rest. Priya said that the ghost was not malevolent, that it did not harm anyone, but that it was trapped in its final duty, endlessly patrolling the path it had been assigned, unable to move on because the task had never been completed. She told Marcus that the best thing he could do was to avoid the park at dusk, to respect the space and the spirits that inhabited it, and to understand that some places carry their history in ways that cannot be explained or rationalized. Marcus listened, and he wanted to dismiss it as superstition, as folklore, but he could not forget the feeling of that cold, the look in those eyes, the way the figure had stepped backward into nothingness as though it had done so 1,000 times before, and would do so 1,000 times more. Marcus left Singapore 6 months later, his internship complete, and he returned to Portland with stories about the food and the efficiency and the strange blend of cultures that made the city unique. But he never told anyone except his closest friends about what happened at Labrador Park, because he knew how it sounded, knew that people would think he had imagined it or exaggerated it or misinterpreted something mundane. But on quiet nights, when he went for a run through his own neighborhood, he sometimes heard footsteps behind him, and his heart would skip a beat before he turned and saw a neighbor or a fellow jogger, someone real and solid and alive. And he would feel a wave of relief that was tinged with the memory of that twilight in Singapore, when he had been followed by something that was none of those things. He never jogged at dusk anymore, never ran through places that felt too quiet or too heavy with history, because he had learned that some boundaries are real, even if they cannot be seen, and that the past does not always stay buried, especially in places where violence and death have left their mark. The footsteps still echoed in his memory, perfectly synchronized, relentlessly patient, and he knew that somewhere on the other side of the world, in a park overlooking the southern coast of Singapore, a figure in a torn uniform was still marching, still keeping pace with whoever was foolish or unlucky enough to cross its path, forever trapped in the duty that had killed him and that he could never complete. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one to emerge from Singapore's haunted corners. In fact, the city's history runs deeper than most visitors realize, layered with traditions and beliefs that predate the modern skyline by centuries. What happened to Marcus at Labrador Park was a reminder that the past refuses to stay silent. But the next story takes place in a very different setting, one where the boundaries between hospitality and the supernatural blur in ways that are far more intimate and far more disturbing. This is the story of a young woman who thought she had found the perfect place to stay, only to discover that she was not the only guest in the house, and that some presences do not need permission to make themselves known. Emily Chandler had booked the Airbnb in Joo Chiat because the photos looked charming and authentic, the kind of Peranakan shophouse she had seen in travel blogs, with its pastel walls and ornate tiles and wooden shutters that opened onto a narrow street lined with similar houses. She was 26, a freelance graphic designer from Austin, Texas, and she had come to Singapore for a month-long work project that allowed her to explore the city in between deadlines. The host, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Lim, had met her at the door with a warm smile and a glass of cold chrysanthemum tea, and had given her a brief tour of the house, pointing out the vintage furniture and the family photographs that lined the walls, explaining that the house had been in her family for 3 generations and that she only rented out the upstairs bedroom to help with maintenance costs. Emily had loved it immediately, had felt a sense of calm and authenticity that was missing from the sterile hotel room she usually stayed in, and she had thanked Mrs. Lim profusely before hauling her suitcase up the narrow staircase to the second floor. The bedroom was small but cozy, with a high ceiling and a large wooden wardrobe that dominated one wall, and a window that looked out over the rooftops and the distant glitter of the city skyline. She unpacked, arranged her laptop and work materials on the small desk, and settled in for what she hoped would be a productive and peaceful stay. The first 2 nights were uneventful, and Emily fell asleep easily, lulled by the unfamiliar sounds of the neighborhood, the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional burst of conversation from the street below. But on the 3rd night, she woke to a sound that made her sit up abruptly, her heart pounding before she was fully conscious of what had disturbed her. It was knocking, soft and rhythmic, 3 taps followed by a pause, then 3 more taps, and it was coming from inside the room. She reached for her phone, fumbling in the darkness, and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the room. But everything looked normal. The furniture undisturbed, the door closed, the window shut. The knocking came again, and this time she pinpointed the source. It was coming from the wardrobe, from somewhere inside the heavy wooden structure that stood against the far wall. Emily's first thought was that it was some kind of animal, a rat or a lizard that had gotten trapped inside, and she felt a surge of annoyance mixed with pity, because the last thing she wanted was to deal with a panicked creature in the middle of the night. She got out of bed, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and approached the wardrobe cautiously, pressing her ear against the door and listening. The knocking stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. And then she heard something else, a faint rustling, like fabric being moved or shifted, and she felt her pulse quicken because the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful to be an animal. She gripped the handle of the wardrobe door, hesitated, and then pulled it open quickly, shining her phone light inside. Her clothes hung neatly on the rail, her shoes lined up at the bottom, and there was nothing else, no animal, no obvious source for the sound, and she felt a wave of relief mixed with confusion. She closed the door, attributed the noise to old wood settling in the humidity, and went back to bed. But it took her a long time to fall asleep, and when she finally did, her dreams were strange and fragmented, filled with images of empty rooms and faces she did not recognize. The knocking returned the next night, and the night after that, always at the same time, around 3 a.m, always coming from the wardrobe, and always stopping the moment Emily got out of bed to investigate. She mentioned it to Mrs. Lim over breakfast on the 4th day, trying to keep her tone light and casual, and Mrs. Lim's expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of something that might have been concern or resignation before she smiled and said that old houses made all kinds of noises, that the wood expanded and contracted with the temperature and humidity, and that Emily should not worry about it. But there was something in Mrs. Lim's tone that felt rehearsed, as though she had given this explanation before, and Emily felt a prickle of unease that she could not quite shake. She decided to ignore it, to focus on her work and enjoy the experience of living in such a unique place. But the knocking continued, and it began to feel less like a quirk of the house and more like something intentional, something that was trying to get her attention. On the 6th night, Emily resolved to stay awake and confront whatever was causing the noise, and she sat up in bed with her laptop open, working on a design project and waiting for the inevitable sound. It came right on schedule. 3 soft taps, pause, 3 more taps, and Emily set her laptop aside and walked to the wardrobe, her movements quick and determined. She yanked the door open, and this time she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat, a figure standing among her clothes, pressed back against the rear panel of the wardrobe, so still and pale that for a moment Emily thought it was a mannequin or a trick of the shadows. But then the figure moved, just slightly, and Emily realized with a cold jolt of terror that it was a woman dressed in a traditional kabaya, the kind of intricate embroidered blouse that Peranakan women wore, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and her face so pale it seemed to glow in the dim light. The woman was staring at Emily, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her expression was blank, devoid of emotion, as though she were looking at something far away or deep within herself. Emily stumbled backward, a scream building in her throat, and she blinked just once. And when her eyes opened again, the woman was gone, simply vanished, leaving nothing but Emily's clothes swaying gently on the rail as though disturbed by a breeze. Emily did not sleep for the rest of the night, and she spent the hours until dawn sitting on her bed with every light in the room turned on, staring at the wardrobe and replaying what she had seen over and over in her mind. She told herself it had been a hallucination, that she had been half asleep, and her brain had filled in details that were not there. But the image of that pale face and those unblinking eyes was too vivid, too clear to dismiss so easily. In the morning, she packed her things quickly, her hands shaking, and went downstairs to tell Mrs. Lim that she needed to leave, that something had happened and she no longer felt comfortable staying in the house. Mrs. Lim was in the kitchen, preparing tea, and when she saw Emily's face, she sighed deeply and set down the teapot, gesturing for Emily to sit at the table. She did not seem surprised, did not ask what had happened, and that in itself was confirmation that Emily had not imagined anything. Mrs. Lim poured 2 cups of tea, sat down across from Emily, and began to speak in a quiet, measured tone, as though she were sharing a burden she had carried for a long time. She explained that the house had been built over the site of an old family shrine, a small altar where her grandmother and great-grandmother had made offerings to their ancestors, and that when the shrine was dismantled to make room for the modern structure, something had been disturbed, some connection between the living and the dead that should have been maintained. Mrs. Lim said that her grandmother had been a devout woman, deeply committed to the rituals and traditions of their Peranakan heritage, and that when she died, her spirit had not moved on, but had remained in the house, attached to the place where she had spent her entire life. The figure Emily had seen was her grandmother, or at least the spirit of her grandmother, and Mrs. Lim referred to it as a protective presence, an ancestral guardian that watched over the house and occasionally checked on new tenants to ensure they were respectful and meant no harm. Emily listened, her tea untouched, and she felt a mix of emotions, fear, and disbelief, and a strange, reluctant fascination, because Mrs. Lim spoke with such conviction, such matter-of-fact acceptance, that it was impossible to dismiss her words as fantasy or delusion. Mrs. Lim explained that the knocking was the spirit's way of announcing her presence, that it was a ritual gesture, a polite warning that she was there and watching, and that opening the wardrobe was the spirit's way of revealing herself, of making her existence known to those who stayed in the house. She said that the spirit had never harmed anyone, that it was simply fulfilling its role as a guardian, and that Emily should consider it an honor to have been acknowledged, because the spirit did not appear to everyone, only to those it deemed worthy of observation. Mrs. Lim's tone was soothing, almost apologetic, as though she were explaining a quirk of the house rather than the presence of a ghost, and she offered to reduce the rent if Emily would consider staying, assuring her that the spirit would not appear again now that it had completed its inspection. Emily wanted to leave, wanted to pack her things and find a hotel and never think about the house or the pale woman in the wardrobe again. But there was something in Mrs. Lim's eyes, a sadness or a weariness, that made her hesitate. She thought about the stories her own grandmother had told her, about the spirits of ancestors watching over their families, about the importance of respecting the past, and she realized that what had terrified her was not malice, but the collision of two worlds, the modern and the traditional, the rational and the inexplicable. She asked Mrs. Lim what she should do, how she should behave, and Mrs. Lim smiled gently and said that all she needed to do was show respect, to acknowledge the spirit's presence with a small nod or a quiet word of thanks, and to understand that the house was not just a place to sleep, but a living connection to a history that stretched back generations. Emily stayed, though every night for the rest of her time in the house, she felt a low-level tension, a heightened awareness of every sound and shadow, and she found herself whispering a quiet thank you before she went to sleep, addressing the empty air and hoping that whatever presence inhabited the house would accept her gesture. The knocking did not return, and the wardrobe door stayed closed, but Emily sometimes felt a coldness in the room, a sense of being watched that was not entirely unpleasant, more curious than threatening, and she began to think of the spirit not as a ghost, but as a kind of silent roommate, an invisible guardian that existed in a space between the tangible and the intangible. On her last day in Singapore, she left a small offering on the dresser, a handful of incense sticks, and a thank you note written in careful English. And when she said goodbye to Mrs. Lim, the older woman hugged her tightly and thanked her for understanding, for not running away, for respecting the traditions that held the house together. Emily flew back to Austin with a story she knew she could never fully explain, a story that sounded absurd when she tried to tell it to friends, but that had changed something fundamental in the way she thought about the world, about the layers of history and belief that existed beneath the surface of everyday life. She never forgot the pale face in the wardrobe, the unblinking eyes that had stared at her with an intensity that felt both ancient and immediate, and she found herself thinking about it often, especially late at night, when the world was quiet and the boundaries between what is real and what is possible seemed thinner than they should be. She had been checked, inspected, and ultimately accepted by something that should not exist, and the experience had left her with a respect for the unseen, for the traditions and rituals that people maintain, not because they are convenient or rational, but because they acknowledge a truth that modernity often tries to forget, that we are not alone, that the past is never truly past, and that some presences do not need our permission to watch over us, to judge us, and occasionally to make themselves known. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level, because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying. We will explore encounters where the spirits are not content to simply observe, where the line between the living and the dead becomes dangerously unclear, and where those who stumble into these situations find themselves changed in ways they never expected. If you want to, there is a link to buy me a coffee in the description. Only if you want to, of course. I already appreciate you listening to my videos. But for now, steel yourself, because what is coming will test the limits of what you believe is possible, and remind you that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The doors we are about to step through are not marked with warnings or protected by rituals. They are the ordinary spaces of modern life, the office buildings and nature trails that thousands pass through every day without incident. But for a few unlucky souls, these places reveal themselves to be something else entirely. Thresholds where the dead still move with purpose and intention, where the past bleeds into the present in ways that security cameras cannot capture and logic cannot explain, and where the living find themselves caught in encounters that leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about reality. Daniel Reeves was sitting alone in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of an office building in Changi Business Park when he first saw the woman walking past, her silhouette clear against the fluorescent-lit hallway. And something about the way she moved, slow and purposeful, made him look up from his laptop screen. It was nearly midnight, and he had been working for 6 straight hours, debugging a security vulnerability that his team needed to patch before the Monday morning deadline, and he had assumed he was the only person left in the building except for the security guard in the lobby 14 floors below. The woman passed the glass wall once, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and Daniel watched her reflection in the dark window to his left, noting the formal office attire, the hair pulled back in a neat bun, the way she held her shoulders rigid as though carrying an invisible weight. He returned his attention to his code, but a few minutes later she passed again, same direction, same measured pace. And this time Daniel felt a prickle of unease because there was nothing in that direction except empty offices and a dead-end corridor that led to the emergency stairwell. Daniel was 31 years old, originally from Seattle, and he had been working in Singapore for nearly 2 years as a senior cybersecurity specialist for a multinational firm that handled data protection for banks and government agencies. He was used to working late, had always been the type to lose track of time when he was deep in a problem, and he prided himself on his ability to focus in empty offices while the rest of the world slept. Changi Business Park was a sprawling complex of modern buildings on the eastern edge of the island, surrounded by green spaces and located conveniently close to the airport. And Daniel's office occupied several floors of a building that was barely 5 years old, all glass and steel and automated climate control, the kind of structure that felt more like a spaceship than a workplace. He had never found it particularly atmospheric, had never felt uneasy in the building despite working alone on countless late nights, and the idea that it might be haunted would have struck him as absurd if anyone had suggested it. Singapore felt too modern, too controlled for ghost stories, and Daniel had always been skeptical of the supernatural, the kind of person who needed evidence and data before accepting anything that fell outside the bounds of conventional science. But as the woman passed the conference room for the 3rd time, moving in that same deliberate way, Daniel felt his skepticism waver because there was something wrong about her movement, something mechanical and repetitive that made him think of a loop playing over and over, a video stuck on repeat. He stood up, his chair rolling backward with a soft hiss, and he walked to the door of the conference room, pulling it open and stepping into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow across the empty corridor, and Daniel looked left and right, expecting to see the woman somewhere nearby, perhaps entering one of the offices or standing by the elevator, but the hallway was completely empty. He walked to the end of the corridor, his own footsteps echoing in the silence, and he checked the emergency stairwell, pushing open the heavy door and peering into the concrete shaft. But there was no one there. No sound of footsteps descending or ascending, nothing to indicate that anyone had passed through recently. Daniel stood there for a moment, confused and slightly irritated, because he knew what he had seen, had watched the woman pass 3 times through glass walls that provided an unobstructed view, and there was no way she could have disappeared so completely in the few seconds it had taken him to reach the door. He returned to the conference room, telling himself that she must have entered one of the offices and closed the door behind her, that his tired brain was making the situation seem stranger than it was, and he sat back down at his laptop, determined to finish his work and leave the building before his imagination ran any further wild. The clicking sound started about 10 minutes later, faint but distinct, the unmistakable rhythm of heels against polished floor, and it was coming from behind him, from somewhere in the hallway he had just searched. Daniel turned in his chair, peering through the glass wall, and he saw nothing. The corridor was empty as before, but the sound continued, steady and relentless, coming closer, and then he heard it pass directly behind his chair, so close that he should have been able to reach out and touch whoever was making the noise. His heart rate spiked, his hands clenching into fists, and he spun around, looking at the empty space behind him, and the clicking continued, moving away now, heading toward the far end of the conference room where there was only a solid wall and no door. Daniel stood up abruptly, his chair toppling backward with a crash that made him jump, and he backed away from the sound, pressing himself against the glass wall and watching as absolutely nothing moved through the room. Nothing he could see, but the sound was undeniable, those heels clicking with perfect regularity against the floor. The sound reached the far wall and stopped, and for several seconds, there was absolute silence, and then it started again, returning, walking back toward him, and Daniel felt his breath coming in short gasps because he could not see anything, could not rationalize what was happening, and the professional, logical part of his brain that dealt in code and systems and predictable outcomes was simply shutting down in the face of something it could not process. He grabbed his laptop and his bag, moving quickly toward the door, and as he reached for the handle, the clicking sound suddenly accelerated, breaking into a run, rushing toward him from across the room, and Daniel yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, his pulse pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He did not stop moving until he reached the elevator, and he hammered the button repeatedly, his eyes fixed on the conference room behind him, watching for any sign of movement, any shadow that might explain what he had just experienced. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Daniel stepped inside, his back pressed against the wall, and as the doors began to close, he saw her, the woman in office attire, standing in the hallway exactly where he had been standing moments before, and she was looking directly at him, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to absorb the light around them. The elevator door slid shut, cutting off his view, and Daniel stood there shaking, his mind racing through possible explanations and finding none that made sense. He rode down to the lobby in silence, and when the doors opened, he walked quickly to the security desk, where a young guard was sitting with his phone, watching a video with the volume turned low. Daniel asked if anyone else was in the building, if the guard had seen a woman in office clothes enter or leave recently, and the guard looked at him with mild confusion and said that Daniel was the only person who had signed in on the 14th floor that night, that the building was otherwise empty except for a few cleaning staff on the lower floors. Daniel insisted that there was someone upstairs, that he had seen her multiple times, and the guard offered to check the security footage, leading Daniel to a small room behind the desk where multiple monitors showed live feeds from cameras throughout the building. They scrolled back through the footage, finding the timestamp for when Daniel had first seen the woman pass the conference room, and they watched the recording play out, showing the hallway outside the glass wall, empty and still, with no one walking past. Daniel felt his stomach drop because he could see himself in the footage, sitting at the table, looking up and watching something pass, his head tracking movement that the camera did not capture. They fast-forwarded to the moment when he had stood and left the conference room, and the footage showed Daniel standing alone in the hallway, turning in circles, reacting to sounds or sights that were not visible on screen, and then returning to the conference room looking confused and agitated. The guard glanced at Daniel with an expression that was somewhere between concern and skepticism, and he suggested that Daniel might have been working too hard, that exhaustion could cause all kinds of perceptual distortions, but his tone was careful, too careful, as though he had heard similar stories before. Daniel asked him directly if the building was haunted, if other people had reported strange experiences, and the guard hesitated, clearly weighing how much to say before admitting that there had been incidents, that some employees refused to work late on certain floors, and that there were rumors about a woman who had died in the building a few years ago. He did not offer details, did not want to gossip or spread unverified information, but he mentioned that it had been during a particularly brutal period of overtime, when deadlines were impossible and people were working 18-hour days, and that the woman had collapsed at her desk from exhaustion and stress, and by the time anyone found her, it was too late. Daniel left the building that night and did not return for 3 days, calling in sick and working from home, and when he finally went back to the office, he requested a transfer to a different floor, citing noise and lighting issues rather than the real reason. His colleagues noticed the change in him, noticed that he no longer stayed late, that he packed up his things and left precisely at 6 in the evening, and when one of them asked him about it over lunch, Daniel debated how much to tell. He settled for saying that he had seen something on the 14th floor that he could not explain, something that made him uncomfortable working there alone, and his colleague nodded knowingly and said that he was not the first person to have that reaction, that the 14th floor had a reputation, whispered about in break rooms and acknowledged with nervous jokes, but never officially discussed. The colleague told Daniel that the woman who died had been an executive, someone who had pushed herself relentlessly, who had believed that success required sacrifice and that rest was weakness, and that her death had been ruled natural causes, but had felt like anything but natural to those who knew her. He said that people who worked late on that floor sometimes reported seeing her, always in the same outfit she had worn in her final days, always walking the same route she had walked when she was alive, pacing the corridors during those long nights when she refused to go home. The colleague said that security footage never captured her, that she existed in some space between what was real and what was recorded, and that those who saw her often found themselves questioning their own sanity, because how do you prove something that leaves no evidence, that appears only to you and disappears the moment you try to document it? Daniel finished his contract in Singapore, but did not renew it, and he returned to Seattle with a new job and a determination to work reasonable hours, to maintain boundaries between his professional and personal life, to never again stay in an empty office past midnight. He told a few close friends about what had happened, and their reactions ranged from skepticism to fascination. But no one truly understood what it felt like to stand in that hallway, hearing footsteps approach from behind, and knowing with absolute certainty that turning around would reveal nothing, or worse, would reveal something that should not be there. He thought about the woman often, about the expression on her face in that final glimpse before the elevator doors closed, and he wondered if she knew she was dead, if she was trapped in some loop of her final weeks, endlessly repeating the patterns that had killed her, or if she was aware, conscious, and simply unable to leave, bound to the building by some combination of unfinished business and the sheer force of her dedication. The clicking of heels on polished floors became a sound that made him tense, even in crowded spaces, even in broad daylight, because it reminded him of that night, of the moment when the rational world he had always trusted revealed itself to be far thinner and more fragile than he had believed. And he knew that somewhere on the 14th floor of a building in Shawnee Business Park, a woman was still walking, still working, still refusing to rest because death had not released her from the obligations she had accepted in life. And because some prisons are built not from walls, but from the choices we make and the patterns we repeat until they become the only reality we know. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The city holds its ghosts in glass towers and air-conditioned corridors, places where death seems impossible because everything is so clean and controlled and modern. But nature holds spirits of a different kind, older and more patient, the kind that wait in forests and beside still water, watching for those who stray from the path or linger too long past sunset. The next story takes us away from fluorescent lights and security cameras into the green heart of Singapore, where the rules are different, where technology offers no protection, and where a single wrong turn can lead to encounters that have been repeated for generations, encounters that tourists and locals alike have learned to fear because the forest does not forget, and neither do the things that live within it. Andrew Morrison had been in Singapore for less than a week when he decided to hike McRitchie Reservoir. And by the time he realized he had made a serious mistake, the sun was already sinking below the treetops, and the forest around him had transformed from a pleasant nature trail into something darker and far more oppressive. He was 28, a backpacker from Colorado, traveling through Southeast Asia on a shoestring budget, with nothing but a backpack, a cheap smartphone, and an overly optimistic sense of his own navigational abilities. He had read online that McRitchie was one of Singapore's best nature reserves, with well-maintained trails and a famous treetop walk that offered stunning views of the surrounding jungle. And he had set out in the late afternoon, thinking he would have plenty of time to complete the loop before dark. What he had not accounted for was how quickly the light faded under the dense canopy, how similar all the trails looked once you were deep in the forest, and how easy it was to take a wrong turn when you were relying on a phone with a dying battery and inconsistent GPS signal. Andrew had spent the previous 3 months traveling through Thailand and Malaysia, staying in hostels and sleeping on overnight buses, stretching his budget as far as it would go, and Singapore had been a shock to his system, expensive and clean and almost sterile compared to the chaotic cities he had grown accustomed to. He had arrived with the intention of staying only a few days, just long enough to see the main sights and recharge before continuing to Indonesia. But something about the city had held his attention, the way it balanced modernity with pockets of wildness, the reservoirs and parks that existed right alongside the skyscrapers, the sense that nature was not something distant, but something integrated into the urban fabric. McRitchie had appealed to him because it felt like an escape, a place where he could spend a few hours away from the crowds and the concrete, walking through genuine jungle that was home to monkeys and monitor lizards and birds he could not identify. He had started the hike with enthusiasm, following the main trail and taking photos of the reservoir, the water dark and still beneath the overhanging trees, and he had felt a sense of peace that had been missing from his travels, a quietness that was restorative rather than empty. But at some point, he had missed a turn or taken a side trail that he thought would loop back to the main path, and by the time he realized he was lost, the forest had grown dim and unfamiliar, and the sounds around him had changed from birdsong to the low hum of insects and the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. He tried to retrace his steps, walking back the way he thought he had come, but the trail branched in ways he did not remember, and every path looked the same. Narrow strips of dirt winding through trees that grew so close together they blocked out what little light remained. Andrew checked his phone and found that the battery was down to 8%. the GPS icon spinning uselessly as it tried to find a signal, and he felt the first real twinge of fear, not panic yet, but a cold awareness that he was in a genuinely dangerous situation. He had read about people getting lost in forests, about how easy it was to walk in circles, how quickly dehydration and exhaustion could set in, and he knew that spending a night in the jungle was not just uncomfortable, but potentially deadly, especially if he could not find water or got injured trying to navigate in the dark. He kept walking, forcing himself to stay calm, telling himself the reserve was not that large, that if he kept moving he would eventually hit a road or a trail marker or some sign of civilization. The forest around him seemed to press closer, the trees looming like silent observers, and he became hyper-aware of every sound, the crack of branches, the distant call of an animal he could not identify, the whisper of wind through leaves that sounded almost like voices. He was about to stop and try to build some kind of shelter when he saw the old man standing on the trail ahead, partially obscured by the gathering shadows, and relief flooded through him so powerfully that he nearly laughed out loud. The old man was wearing simple clothes, dark trousers, and a light-colored shirt, and he was standing very still, one hand raised in a gesture that could have been a wave or a warning. Andrew called out to him, his voice too loud in the quiet forest, asking if he knew the way back to the main trail, and the old man smiled, a slow spreading expression that did not quite reach his eyes, and he spoke in perfect English, his accent faintly British, saying that he knew these trails well and that he could show Andrew a shortcut that would get him back to the entrance in 20 minutes. Andrew felt a surge of gratitude, thanking him profusely, and he hurried forward to join the old man, noticing as he got closer that the man's skin was very pale, almost gray in the dim light, and that his clothes, while clean, looked dated, the kind of simple garments you might see in old photographs. The old man turned and began walking deeper into the forest, away from the direction Andrew had been heading, and Andrew hesitated, a small voice in the back of his mind suggesting that this did not feel right, that shortcuts should lead toward civilization rather than deeper into the jungle. But his fear of being lost overrode his caution, and he followed, his eyes fixed on the old man's back as they moved through the increasingly dense undergrowth. They walked for several minutes in silence, the old man moving with surprising speed for his age, never looking back to check if Andrew was keeping up, and Andrew found himself struggling to match the pace, his feet catching on roots and vines that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. He called out, asking how much farther, and the old man did not respond, just kept walking, his form becoming harder to see as the darkness deepened, and Andrew felt his unease growing, sharpening into something closer to alarm. The trail they were on, if it could even be called a trail, was barely visible, more of a suggestion than an actual path, and Andrew realized with a cold jolt that they were heading downhill, toward what sounded like running water, which made no sense if they were trying to reach the entrance. He stopped walking, his breath coming hard, and he called out more forcefully, demanding that the old man stop and explain where they were going. And the old man finally turned, his face now fully visible in a shaft of moonlight that had somehow penetrated the canopy. His expression was no longer friendly, no longer reassuring, but blank and distant, and his eyes were dark voids that reflected no light, and Andrew felt his legs go weak because he knew, with absolute certainty, that the person standing in front of him was not alive, had not been alive for a very long time. The old man raised one hand, pointing deeper into the forest, toward the sound of water, and his mouth moved as though he were speaking, but no sound came out. And then he took a step backward, and another, moving with unnatural smoothness, and he simply dissolved, not fading gradually, but vanishing instantaneously, as though he had been an image projected onto the air and someone had switched off the projector. Andrew stood frozen, his mind refusing to process what he had just seen, and the forest around him fell into a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence, pressing against his ears and making his heart pound in the void left by the absence of sound. He backed away from the spot where the old man had been, his hands shaking, and he turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth with no regard for direction or safety, driven by a primal need to put distance between himself and whatever he had just encountered. Branches whipped his face, roots tried to trip him, and he fell twice, scraping his hands and knees. But he kept moving, kept running, until he saw lights ahead, artificial lights, and he burst out onto a paved path where a group of rangers with flashlights were conducting what appeared to be a search. They caught him as he stumbled toward them, his legs giving out, and they wrapped him in a blanket and gave him water, asking where he had been, how he had gotten so far off the trail. And Andrew tried to explain, his words coming out in a confused rush about getting lost and the old man and the shortcut that led nowhere. One of the rangers, an older Malay man with kind eyes and weathered hands, listened patiently, and when Andrew finished, the ranger exchanged glances with his colleagues before speaking in a careful, measured tone. He explained that Andrew was not the first person to encounter the old man, that there were stories going back decades about a figure who appeared to lost hikers, always offering to show them a shortcut, always leading them deeper into the forest, toward the reservoir or the streams that fed it. The ranger said that the reservoir had a dark history, that there had been drownings over the years, some accidental and some deliberate, and that the forest itself was believed to be inhabited by spirits, remnants of the people who had lived in the area before the reservoir was built, whose graves and shrines had been flooded when the valley was dammed. He said that these spirits were not necessarily malevolent, but they were unpredictable, and they had a particular interest in outsiders, visitors who did not know the rules, who wandered into the forest without proper respect or preparation. The ranger said that the old man was believed to be the spirit of someone who had drowned in the early days of the reservoir, someone who had perhaps gotten lost just as Andrew had, and who now existed in a liminal space, forever searching for the way out, forever trying to help but leading others into the same trap that had claimed him. Andrew spent that night in the ranger station, too shaken to return to his hostel, and in the morning they drove him to the entrance and watched as he got into a taxi, making sure he actually left the area. He told himself later that he had been dehydrated, disoriented, that his mind had conjured the old man as a coping mechanism, a projection of his need for help in a desperate situation, but the explanation felt hollow, insufficient to account for the vividness of the encounter, the clarity with which he had seen the old man's face, the way the figure had moved and spoken and then vanished. He left Singapore 2 days later, cutting his visit short, and as his plane lifted off from Changi Airport, he looked out the window at the green canopy below, at the reservoirs glinting in the morning sun, and he thought about the people who had disappeared into those forests over the years, the hikers and joggers and explorers who had taken a wrong turn and never found their way back. He thought about the old man, forever trapped in his final moments, forever offering help that led only to more danger, and he wondered how many others had followed that figure into the darkness, how many had been led toward the water and never returned, their bodies lost in the depths or absorbed by the jungle, their stories becoming whispers that rangers told new hires as warnings, cautionary tales about the importance of staying on marked trails and never hiking alone after dark. Andrew never went hiking alone again, never ventured into forests without a guide or a companion, and whenever he saw an old man standing by himself on a trail, he gave them a wide berth, his pulse quickening, his mind replaying that moment when the figure had turned and revealed eyes that held no light, no warmth, nothing human, just an endless emptiness that spoke of decades spent wandering, searching, unable to find peace or rest or the path that would finally lead home. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last 2 stories are different, quieter but far more disturbing. The kind that stay with you long after the telling ends, because they do not rely on sudden shocks or visible horrors, but on the slow realization that something is deeply wrong, that the world you thought you understood operates by rules you never learned and cannot begin to comprehend. These are stories about silence and absence, about the things that should be there but are not, and the things that should not be there but are, and they remind us that the most frightening encounters are often the ones that seem almost normal, almost explainable, until you look closer and see the cracks in reality, the places where the familiar becomes alien and the safe becomes dangerous, and by then it is already too late to turn back, because you have crossed a threshold you did not know existed, and there's no map that can guide you home. Rebecca Hartley raised her camera to photograph the intricate carvings on a weathered tombstone when she saw the boy through her viewfinder, sitting cross-legged on top of a moss-covered grave about 30 feet away, and he was waving at her with a slow, deliberate motion that made her lower the camera and look at him directly, trying to understand why a child would be alone in Bukit Brown Cemetery in the middle of a weekday afternoon. He looked to be about 7 or 8 years old, wearing clothes that seemed oddly formal for a child, dark shorts and a white-collared shirt, and his face was pale, almost luminous in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the dense canopy overhead. Rebecca waved back, uncertain, glancing around to see if there were parents or guardians nearby. But the cemetery was empty except for the two of them, silent but for the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic from the surrounding roads. The boy stood up, still waving, and then he turned and ran behind a large headstone carved with Chinese characters, moving with a speed that seemed unnatural, and Rebecca felt a flutter of concern because the cemetery was overgrown and uneven, full of exposed roots and crumbling structures that would be dangerous for a child running at that pace. Rebecca was 23 years old, the daughter of an American diplomat stationed in Singapore, and she had spent the past 6 months exploring the city with her camera, documenting heritage sites and historical landmarks for a photography project she hoped would eventually become a book or exhibition. She had grown up moving between postings, living in half a dozen countries before she was 18, and she had developed a fascination with places that existed outside the tourist circuits, the forgotten corners and abandoned structures that held stories no guidebook would tell. Bukit Brown had caught her attention because it was one of the largest Chinese cemeteries in Singapore, sprawling across more than 200 acres of jungle-covered hillside, home to thousands of graves dating back to the 19th century, many of them belonging to prominent families whose descendants had long since moved away or lost track of their ancestral connections. The cemetery had been slated for redevelopment, roads and housing projects that would consume the land, and heritage groups had been fighting to preserve what they could, documenting the graves and the stories they represented before they disappeared beneath concrete and asphalt. Rebecca had visited twice before, always during the day, always with a sense of reverence for the history contained in the elaborate tombs and the fading inscriptions, and she had never felt uneasy or threatened, had found the place peaceful despite its association with death. She had come alone today because her usual photography partner had canceled at the last minute, and she had assured her parents that she would be careful, that the cemetery was safe during daylight hours, that she had her phone and would be back before dinner. She walked toward the headstone where the boy had disappeared, calling out to him in a friendly voice, asking if he was lost, if he needed help finding his way out, and she rounded the stone, expecting to see him crouching behind it or playing some kind of game. But there was nothing there, just more graves and undergrowth and the endless maze of paths that crisscrossed the cemetery. Rebecca felt a small knot of confusion tighten in her stomach, because the boy could not have run far in the few seconds it had taken her to reach the spot, and there was nowhere to hide, no structures large enough to conceal a child, unless he had climbed a tree or crawled into one of the old burial vaults that dotted the hillside. She called out again, louder this time, and her voice echoed strangely, swallowed by the dense vegetation, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, more oppressive, as though the cemetery itself were holding its breath. She raised her camera and took a few shots of the area, thinking that maybe she had imagined the boy, that her eyes had played tricks in the shifting light. But even as she thought it, she knew it was not true, because she had seen him clearly, had watched him move, had locked eyes with him for a brief moment before he ran. She decided to continue her photography session, telling herself that the boy had probably found his way out, or that his parents would be along shortly, and she moved deeper into the cemetery, following a path that led uphill toward a cluster of particularly ornate tombs that she had wanted to photograph for weeks. The boy appeared again about 20 minutes later, this time standing on top of a raised tomb platform, his small figure silhouetted against the sky, and he was waving again with that same slow, deliberate motion. And Rebecca felt her pulse quicken because there was something wrong about the way he stood, too still, too balanced, like a statue rather than a living child. She called out to him, her voice sharper now, tinged with annoyance and growing concern, and she started walking toward him, her camera bouncing against her chest with each step. The boy watched her approach, his arms still raised in that endless wave, and when she was about 15 feet away, he turned and ran again, disappearing behind another tomb, and Rebecca broke into a jog, determined to catch him this time, to find out who he was and why he kept running away. She reached the tomb and circled it quickly, expecting to finally corner him. But once again he was gone, simply vanished, and Rebecca stood there breathing hard, her frustration mounting, because this made no sense. Children did not disappear like smoke, did not move through a cemetery like ghosts. She pulled out her phone to check the time and saw that she had been there for over 2 hours, that the afternoon was fading faster than she had realized, and she decided it was time to leave, to get back to the main entrance before the light failed completely. She took one last photograph of the tomb she had been circling, a wide shot that captured the overgrown path and the jungle pressing in from all sides. And as she lowered her camera, she saw the boy again, standing directly in front of her, no more than 10 feet away. And this time he was not waving, but staring, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Rebecca took a step backward, her breath catching, and she raised her camera instinctively, pressing the shutter release, and the boy smiled, a slow spreading expression that revealed teeth too white and too uniform. And then he turned and sprinted down a side path, moving faster than any child should be able to move, and Rebecca did not follow, could not follow, because every instinct in her body was screaming at her to go the other direction, to get out of the cemetery as quickly as possible. She turned and walked rapidly back toward the entrance, her eyes scanning the paths on either side, half expecting to see the boy appear again. But the cemetery remained empty, silent except for her own footsteps and the hammering of her heart. She reached the main gate as the sun was setting, the light turning golden and then orange, casting long shadows that made the tombs look like crouching figures. And she got into her car with shaking hands and drove home without looking back. It was only later that evening, when she uploaded the photographs to her laptop, that she saw him in the images, the boy appearing in shot after shot, sometimes in the background, sometimes in the foreground, sometimes barely visible at the edge of the frame, but always there, always watching. And Rebecca realized with a cold rush of horror that she had not pressed the shutter for most of these images, that her camera had taken them automatically, or something had triggered it, capturing moments she had not consciously chosen to record. She spent the next several hours going through every photograph from that day, and the boy appeared in more than 30 of them, his figure clear and detailed, wearing the same formal clothes, always positioned in ways that should have been impossible, standing on graves that Rebecca had not photographed directly, appearing in shots she had taken before she ever saw him, as though he had been there all along, invisible to her eyes, but visible to the camera. In some images he was waving, in others he was simply standing and staring, and in one particularly disturbing shot he was reaching toward the camera, his hand extended as though trying to touch the lens, and Rebecca could see his face clearly in that image, could see that his eyes were not quite right, the pupils too large and too dark, like wells that had no bottom. She called a friend who worked with the heritage group that was documenting Bukit Brown, a local historian named Valerie who had spent years researching the cemetery and the families buried there. and she explained what had happened, her voice unsteady, expecting skepticism or concern for her mental state. But Valerie listened quietly, and when Rebecca finished, she sighed deeply and said that Rebecca was not the first person to encounter the children, that there were multiple reports over the years of child spirits in the cemetery, particularly in the older sections where families had buried multiple generations. Valerie explained that many of the children buried there had died young from diseases that were common in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and that some of them, according to local belief, had become playful spirits, not malevolent but lonely, seeking companionship and attention from the living, particularly from foreigners who did not know the proper protocols for visiting the cemetery, who did not make offerings or show the appropriate respect. Valerie said that the spirits were especially drawn to cameras, to people who were documenting the graves, because they wanted to be remembered, wanted to be seen, and that they would sometimes appear in photographs as a way of asserting their presence, of reminding the living that they still existed in some form. She told Rebecca that the boy was likely one of these spirits, that his repeated waving was an invitation, a request to follow him deeper into the cemetery, and that Rebecca had been wise not to chase him too far, because there were stories of people who had followed the children and gotten lost, wandering for hours in areas that should have been familiar, unable to find their way out until after dark when the cemetery took on a different character entirely. Valerie said that the spirits were not trying to harm anyone, that their intentions were more innocent, more childlike, but that their understanding of boundaries and consequences was limited, and that following them could lead to dangerous situations, getting lost, getting injured in the overgrown terrain, or simply staying too long and encountering other, less friendly entities that emerged after sunset. She advised Rebecca to delete the photographs, to perform a simple cleansing ritual that involved burning incense and saying a quiet prayer, and to avoid returning to Bookett Brown alone, at least not without making proper offerings at the entrance, acknowledging the spirits, and asking permission to enter their space. Rebecca followed the advice, burning the incense and whispering an apology to whoever might be listening, and she deleted the photographs one by one, though the images stayed burned into her memory, particularly the one where the boy was reaching toward her, his small hand extended in a gesture that could have been pleading or beckoning or something else entirely. She did not return to Bookett Brown, could not bring herself to go back, even though she knew there were hundreds of graves she had not yet documented, stories she had not yet captured, and her photography project remained incomplete, a collection of images that ended abruptly without explanation. Her parents noticed the change in her, the way she avoided certain topics, the way she checked her camera settings obsessively before every shoot, and when her father asked her what was wrong, she told him a simplified version, leaving out the most disturbing details, saying only that she had encountered something at the cemetery that had shaken her. Her father, a practical man who dealt in policy and diplomacy, suggested that she had been working too hard, that the heat and isolation had gotten to her, but her mother, who had grown up in Manila and had her own stories of encounters with the supernatural, looked at Rebecca with understanding and said that some places held onto their dead more tightly than others, that Singapore, for all its modernity, had never truly severed its connection to the past, and that the spirits here were particularly active because they had been displaced so many times, moved from grave to grave as the city expanded and redeveloped, and they were restless, searching for stability, for acknowledgement, for someone who would remember them. Rebecca left Singapore 6 months later when her father's posting ended, and she moved to New York to pursue a master's degree in documentary photography, and she never mentioned Bookett Brown in her thesis or her exhibitions, never showed the images she had taken before that final day, because how could she explain what had happened? How could she make people understand that she had been followed by a child who was not a child, who had appeared in her photographs without her knowledge, who had reached toward her from some place between life and death, asking for something she could not give and would not have known how to provide even if she understood what was being asked? The boy stayed with her, though, appearing occasionally in her dreams, always waving, always standing on top of a grave, and she would wake with the image fresh in her mind, wondering if he was still there, still waiting, still trying to get someone to follow him. And she felt a deep sadness mixed with her fear, because whatever he wanted, whatever he needed, it was something that the living could not provide. And he would keep waiting, keep waving, keep appearing in photographs taken by strangers who wandered into his territory, forever young, forever lonely, forever trapped in the moment of his death and the centuries that followed. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best. But while the cemetery held spirits of innocence and longing, there are other places where the dead are neither innocent nor forgiving, where luxury and wealth provide no protection against the restless, and where the living work side by side with presences they have learned to acknowledge but never to challenge. The final story takes us to the heart of Singapore's most glamorous district, where tourists shop and dine without ever knowing what exists just floors above their heads, where hotel staff speak in whispers about rooms that should not be occupied, and guests who check in but never truly leave, and where an American engineer learned that some problems cannot be fixed with tools or logic, because the malfunction is not in the machinery, but in the fabric of reality itself. And no amount of training prepares you for the moment when you realize that the person behind you in the mirror is not your reflection, and that turning around will only confirm what you already know in your bones, that you are not alone, that you have never been alone, and that some presences demand acknowledgement whether you are ready to give it or not. Thomas Garrett had been in Singapore for 3 days, sent by his company to address a series of HVAC malfunctions at one of the most prestigious hotels on Orchard Road, and he was standing in the service corridor on the 19th floor, reviewing his work orders on a tablet, when he received yet another service call for room 1912, a suite that according to his records was marked as permanently out of use. He had already been to that room twice in the past 2 days, each time finding the air conditioning running at full blast despite the room being unoccupied, the thermostat displaying temperatures that made no sense, and the lights flickering in patterns that suggested an electrical issue rather than a mechanical one. Both times he had reset the system, checked the wiring, found nothing obviously wrong, and both times he had filed reports stating that the equipment was functioning normally and that the issues were likely due to a faulty sensor or a programming glitch that would require a specialist to address. Now the call had come through again, and Thomas felt a flash of irritation because he had other work to complete, and this particular problem was becoming a time sink that he could not afford. Thomas was 42 years old, a mechanical engineer from Phoenix who specialized in commercial HVAC systems, and he had spent the past 20 years traveling to hotels and office buildings around the world, diagnosing problems and implementing solutions, and he prided himself on his ability to fix anything given enough time and the right tools. He was methodical, patient, and deeply skeptical of anything that could not be measured or quantified, and he had little patience for superstition, or what he considered irrational thinking. Singapore had impressed him with its efficiency and cleanliness, and the hotel he was working in was a study in luxury, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and staff who moved with choreographed precision, attending to guests who paid premium rates for premium service. Thomas had been briefed on the building's systems when he arrived, given access to mechanical rooms and service areas that guests never saw, and he had been told in passing that certain rooms were kept out of rotation for various reasons, maintenance issues or structural concerns, or simply because they were being held for VIP guests who had not yet confirmed their reservations. Room 1912 had been mentioned as one of these, though no one had explained why it was out of use, and Thomas had not thought to ask, assuming it was a routine matter that did not concern him. He took the service elevator to the 19th floor, his tool bag slung over his shoulder, and he walked down the plushly carpeted hallway to room 1912, using his master key card to unlock the door. The room was dark when he entered, the curtains drawn, and he fumbled for the light switch. Finding it and flooding the space with the warm glow of overhead fixtures that revealed a suite decorated in rich burgundy and gold, with expensive furniture and original artwork on the walls. The air conditioning was indeed running. He could hear the hum of the unit and feel the cold air pouring from the vents, and the thermostat on the wall was displaying a temperature of 58 degrees, far colder than any guest would request, and cold enough to cause condensation and potential water damage. Thomas walked to the thermostat and examined it, finding that it had been manually set to that temperature, which made no sense if the room was unoccupied, and he reset it to 72 degrees and waited to see if the system would respond. The unit continued to run, ignoring the new setting, and Thomas felt his irritation deepen into something closer to frustration, because this suggested a problem with the thermostat's communication with the main system, which would require him to access the control panel in the mechanical room and run diagnostics, a process that could take hours. He was about to leave and head to the mechanical room when he noticed the smell, faint but distinct, the scent of jasmine perfume, sweet and cloying, and he looked around the room trying to identify the source, wondering if housekeeping had used some kind of air freshener or if the previous occupant had left behind a fragrance that had saturated the furniture. The smell grew stronger as he moved deeper into the suite, past the sitting area and into the bedroom, and Thomas found himself standing in front of the large mirror that hung above the dresser, staring at his own reflection in the polished glass. The lights in the bedroom were flickering, not dramatically, but in a subtle rhythm that was almost hypnotic, and Thomas made a mental note to check the electrical system as well, because clearly there were multiple issues at play here. He turned away from the mirror and walked to the bathroom, checking the vents there, and when he returned to the bedroom, the lights had stopped flickering and the room was perfectly still, the only sound the steady hum of the air conditioning. He glanced at the mirror as he passed, a casual look, and he stopped abruptly because his reflection was not alone. There was a figure standing behind him, a woman in a dark dress, and he could see her clearly in the glass, even though he knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no one else in the room. His heart lurched, his breath catching, and he spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the tool bag as though it could serve as a weapon. But the space behind him was empty, just the bed and the wall and the door leading back to the sitting area. He turned back to the mirror, his pulse pounding, and the figure was still there, standing in the exact spot where she had been before, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes fixed on his reflection. And Thomas felt his legs go weak because the image in the mirror did not match reality, and that was impossible. Mirrors did not lie. They reflected what was there, nothing more and nothing less. The figure moved, just slightly, tilting her head to one side, and Thomas saw her mouth open as though she were speaking. But no sound reached his ears, and then she began to fade, dissolving like mist, her form becoming transparent and then vanishing entirely. And Thomas was left staring at his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed and visibly shaking. He backed out of the bedroom, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and he left the suite without bothering to collect his tools, stumbling into the hallway and pulling the door shut behind him. He stood there for several long seconds, trying to process what had just happened, trying to find a rational explanation, but his mind kept circling back to the image of that woman. The way she had stood there so calmly, so solidly, visible in the mirror, but not in the room, and he knew that what he had seen was not a trick of the light or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or stress. He took the elevator down to the lobby and found the duty manager, a composed woman named Jasmine, who listened to his stammering explanation with a neutral expression, and when he finished, she asked him to follow her to a private office away from the guest areas. She closed the door, offered him water, and sat down across from him, with her hands folded on the desk, and she spoke in a quiet, measured tone that suggested she had had this conversation before. Jasmine explained that room 1912 had a history, that it was kept out of rotation, not because of mechanical issues, but because of incidents that had occurred there over the years. Incidents that the hotel preferred not to discuss publicly, but that staff members were aware of and had learned to accept. She said that a woman had died in that suite many years ago, a prominent socialite who had been staying at the hotel during a period of personal crisis, and that her death had been ruled a suicide, though there were those who believed the circumstances were more complicated, more ambiguous than the official report suggested. The woman had been found in the bedroom, dressed in her finest clothes and surrounded by jasmine flowers. And the room had been closed for months afterward, renovated and redecorated in an attempt to erase the memory. But the incidents had continued, staff reporting cold spots and flickering lights and the persistent smell of jasmine. And guests who were inadvertently placed in the room often requested transfers after a single night, complaining of unease, of feeling watched, of seeing figures in mirrors and shadows that moved independently of any light source. Jasmine said that the hotel had eventually decided to keep the room permanently out of service, using it only for storage or as a staging area for events, but that the systems in the room seemed to activate on their own, the air conditioning running, the lights turning on as though someone were still occupying the space, still adjusting the temperature and the lighting to their preference. She said that maintenance staff were occasionally sent to the room when automated systems detected activity, but they had learned not to stay long, not to investigate too thoroughly, because those who spent too much time there reported experiences similar to what Thomas had just described, seeing the woman in mirrors, smelling the perfume, hearing sounds that had no source. Thomas listened, his skepticism warring with what he had just experienced, and he wanted to dismiss it as hotel folklore, as stories that grew and mutated over time. But he could not forget the clarity of what he had seen, the way the woman had looked at him through the mirror, the feeling of being observed by something that existed in a space adjacent to his own. Jasmine said that the hotel respected the presence, that housekeeping left small offerings occasionally, flowers or incense, and that they had consulted with spiritual practitioners who advised them to acknowledge the spirit rather than try to banish it, because the woman had been a guest, had paid for the room, and in some sense still considered it her space, and forcing her out would only create more disturbances, more unrest. Thomas asked if other engineers had encountered her, and Jasmine nodded, saying that several had, and that most had requested reassignment, or had simply refused to enter the room again, and that the hotel had learned to work around the issue, marking the suite as permanently unavailable and routing service calls elsewhere. She asked Thomas if he would be willing to continue his work at the hotel, assuring him that he would not be sent back to room 1912, and Thomas agreed, though his hands were still shaking, because he needed the work and because walking away felt like admitting defeat, like allowing fear to dictate his actions. He stayed in Singapore for another 2 weeks, completing his work on the other floors, and he heard more stories from the staff. Whispered conversations in break rooms and service corridors about other rooms that had reputations, about spirits that moved through the hotel like guests who had never checked out. And he began to understand that what he had encountered was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger reality that existed parallel to the everyday operations of the hotel. He never went back to room 1912, could not bring himself to cross that threshold again. And on his final day, he stood in the lobby and looked up at the 19th floor, trying to imagine what it was like to be trapped in a single room for decades, to exist in a state between life and death, unable to move on and unable to truly interact with the world of the living. He thought about the woman, about what she might have been thinking in her final moments, about whether she knew that she was still there, still checking in, still adjusting the thermostat and looking at visitors in the mirror. And he felt a deep sadness mixed with his lingering fear, because whatever had happened to her, whatever circumstances had led to her death, had left her bound to a space that most people passed through without a second thought, a luxury suite that was her prison, her home, her final resting place that would never truly let her rest. Thomas flew back to Phoenix with a story he knew he could never tell his colleagues, because how could he explain to practical, logical people that he had seen a ghost, that he had stood in a room and watched a dead woman appear in a mirror, and that the experience had shaken his understanding of reality so thoroughly that he no longer felt certain about anything? He continued his work, traveled to other hotels and office buildings, fixed air conditioning systems and electrical panels and all the mundane machinery that kept modern buildings functioning. But he never felt quite the same, never approached his work with the same confidence, because he had learned that some problems have no solution, that some presences cannot be reasoned with or removed, and that the world contains spaces where the dead still linger, still assert their right to exist, still demand acknowledgement from the living who stumble into their domain, and all we can do is show respect, offer small gestures of recognition, and hope that when our own time comes, we will be granted the peace that they were denied. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best.